Welcome to episode 2 of the Myth of Polarization. I'm Wally Knox, and this episode is entitled Kennedy to Trump, Three Political Eras. Last time in episode 1, we began to discuss what polarization is in American politics and why we all seem to believe it. Polarization, as you recall, is the opposite of what is the history of American politics for many, many decades. And that was that America had a broad and deep and influential middle to it, a solid center. To the left were the folks of the left. To the right were the folks of the right. But the center frustrated both sides because they couldn't get everything done they wanted to. The center was just too lethargic, too centrist, too what have you, and stabilized America, but frustrated those two opposites. In recent years, we are told, and everyone now believes this, that has completely changed. The centers vanished. Everyone who used to be in the center has chosen sides. They either are solidly on the left or committedly on the right. There's nobody left in the center whatsoever. And the conflicts in our society between left and right are consequently far, far stronger than they have ever been before. It's because we are polarized. We all believe we are polarized. MSNBC and Fox agree on one thing: we are polarized. And if we had further proof of the fact that everyone believes we are polarized, it took place on January the 6th, 2021, when 30,000 people mobilized by President Trump marched on the Capitol and seized it, interrupting the count of electoral college votes that ended up finding that Joe Biden had won the election. It was an astonishing act, and it showed us just how dangerous the belief in polarization is. Because that mob of 30,000 didn't believe that they were on the lunatic fringe of another fringe. They didn't believe that there's a broad center left in American politics, and that the right wing of American politics was just on the right side of that, and that they were way over on the right side of that, a lunatic fringe, and that the left was way to the left of the center. They believed that the center is gone, vanished. Half the country moved left, half the country moved way, way right, and they were not a lunatic fringe. They were the vanguard of half of America. That is what underlay their seizure of the Capitol. So the belief in polarization is a very dangerous thing. But here's the strange part of this. It's hard to find evidence of polarization when you move beyond rhetoric and start looking at facts. Look, if polarization is real, wouldn't you expect to find it in some pretty straightforward places, like, for instance, the structure of American political parties, Democrats, Republicans, and independents? The American National Election Survey has asked Americans since 1952, are you a Democrat? Are you a Republican? Or are you an independent? Pretty straightforward question. And by looking at the answers over time, we should find strong evidence that in recent decades, America has polarized. So let's do that one more time and see what we learn. You recall this is a graph we looked at in episode 1. And the graph asks us the question, where is there evidence of polarization? So let me walk you through this. On the left-hand side, we see the results from the question in 1952. The blue line at the top, back in 1952, almost 46% of us said, I'm a Democrat. That line rose to 46% in 1960 when John F. Kennedy was inaugurated. Way down at the bottom of 1952, we see that green line floating in barely at 20%. Those were the independents in 1952. Totally tiny, absolutely pathetic. And above the independents were that red line, the Republicans floating in at 25, 26, 27, 28% of the American public back in 52. But then look at the shapes of these lines. Let's go back to the blue line of the Democrats at the top. After 1960, Democrats began to decline. Declined in the 60s, declined in the 70s, declined in the 80s, and declined through the first half of the 1990s, and then stabilized for about 1 decade, and then a little bit after the year 2000 began to decline all over again. What does that have to do with polarization? Isn't polarization the theory that Americans have chosen to move to the left or to the right and abandon the center? Look at the Republican line, the red line. It fluctuates. It goes up some years and goes down other years, but it never really gets over 30%. How does that show that polarization is going on in the last 2 or 3 decades? And look at the green line. That's the independents, folks who say, I'm neither political party, I'm an independent. A massive growth between 1960 and 1980 and growth going on today. How does that square with polarization? How do we make sense of the changes in this graph? And how do we put polarization theory into some kind of context? So let me explain to you my own personal point of view. I think there are 3 eras in our current politics that help explain what we have just seen. And let me walk you through those. From 1960 to 1980, I call that the Vietnam era. It's the time of the Vietnam War and the turmoil that brought, the civil rights movement and the huge conflicts in American society over that. And on top of that, what was politely referred to as the counterculture, and the rest of us called sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was a very turbulent time, the Vietnam era. And you can see the turbulence of that time. You can see the loss of faith in Americans in the 2 political parties that had led the country into the Vietnam War and lost the Vietnam War. Both parties, the Democratic Party declined in the Vietnam era, and the Republican Party declined in the Vietnam era. What grew in the Vietnam era? Well, that's pretty obvious. Independents grew from a pitiful pittance to well over 1/3 on their way to 40% of the American public in the Vietnam era. But that era did not go on forever. The independents stabilized and ceased their growth. Ronald Reagan was inaugurated in 1980, and if you agree or disagree with his policies, a period of semi-stability began to take place. The Democratic Party losses continued as Reagan's office continued, but then stabilized. Republicans gained slightly under Ronald Reagan, but then plateaued. That's the long Reagan era. And then as the long Reagan era comes to an end, about the year 2000, we start seeing the chart change once again. The stability of the Democrats, which had existed briefly in the 1990s, deteriorates, and the party again begins a decline. The Republican Party again goes down and then up. It's the independents that resume their growth. So there are 2 eras in which independents have seen growth. The Vietnam era, massive growth. And our times, since the year 2000, when independents are growing and are poised to pass the 40% mark. As I talk to you today, the largest single political group in America is not the Democrats or the Republicans, it is the independents. And there is one political group which has shown consistent growth over time, the independents. So we don't see much evidence of polarization in this at all. What we see are some remarkable big changes, but not polarization. Why, then, do we believe in polarization? Why is all of America obsessed with the idea that there is a left at war with the right and nobody in the middle to stabilize or moderate that. We'll return to that issue and many others in episode 3. I'll see you next time.